You know something? I had an entire script planned out for this video before. I was going to detail my history with Final Fantasy as a whole, and what the connected threads between the entries in the series are because of that, and what it is about them that I found so compelling. But over the course of writing that script, I hope to help better articulate my thoughts in that matter, because I was having a hard time putting my finger on the pulse of it. Each entry is so unique from one another and different in some way, and while many titles may share gameplay similarities, their worlds and stories all felt like Final Fantasy as well, but were drastically different. What was about that? What was all that about? So I wrote this script, and near its conclusion I elected to go take a shower real quick to clear my mind, and like all good ideas, it then struck me. It's probably not the most unique idea ever, maybe it's even been said before, probably has, but I think there is a relatively simple reason that I find Final Fantasy so compelling as a whole. Final Fantasy is like a collection of storybooks, each with their own worlds and stories, but they all have that magical feel to them and their own unique take on the whole hero's journey concept. And despite how varying the series can be in tone, theme, atmosphere, and aesthetic, and nowadays with gameplay, you can kind of boil the stories in the series down to trying to save the world from whatever threat is posed to it in that entry. Most of the games I've played also have some kind of romance arc to them as well, to where almost having a romance story in Final Fantasy feels kind of integral, or at least pretty foundational for the overall feel of a Final Fantasy game to me. Not every one of them has that, or needs it, or is at least overt about it, for the ones I've played, at least. Heck, my favorite Final Fantasy is Final Fantasy XIV, and that one doesn't really have an in-your-face romance story, at least that I recall. Unless you count like Little Sun, I guess, but even then. And I'm not even saying it's mandatory, it's one of those aspects of the storytelling in a Final Fantasy game that feels almost foundational to the series as a whole. This is a series that has been around since 1987, and we're getting the 16th mainline entry later this year in 2023. It's a long time for a series to go, don't you think? And it has changed quite drastically over those years. There are many gameplay similarities for many entries, as I said, and I tend to group Final Fantasies 1 to 10 as one big era of turn-based and ATB-based Final Fantasy games. There's a discussion to be had, and I also fall under the argument that there is quite a difference between traditional turn-based and the ATB system. But the series changed up drastically after Final Fantasy X in terms of gameplay for mainline entries. 11 was an MMO, 12 had the Gambit system, which was hit or miss. Personally, it missed for me. 13 was polarizing to say the freaking least. 14 is also an MMO, but a different style of MMO than 11 was. And then 15, which was real-time action, with a warp sword, which was cool, by the way. And I'll die on that hill. I love that thing. The warp sword, it's cool. Then you had Final Fantasy VII Remake, which tried to bridge the gap between real-time and turn-based, at least, with the classic mode and with the ATB system, but had significant revisions to its real-time action combat formula that was there from 15. It changed a lot, and 16 seems to be continuing that trend, where, yes, it is real-time action, but the revisions to its overall formula make it feel like a completely different gameplay experience, at least from what we have seen so far. The series has always been known for changing itself up, whether that be through an individual mechanic, or through changing the feel or atmosphere of the game's story, or world. Heck, you put 6 and 7 next to each other, and there's so many differences. 6 feels medieval high fantasy, while 7 has this modernish feel to it, with technology and magic. 6 had technology as well as more steampunk in influence, or at least inspiration. It's a wildly different aesthetic, and Final Fantasy loves mixing that up from time to time, alongside a bunch of other things like perspective, camera angles, types of main characters, types of party members, types of activities to do in the overworld, stuff like that. And while that has always drawn criticism from a certain group of traditionalists when it comes to Final Fantasy, I find value in the attempt to try new things to the series as a whole. I think there's something intrinsically valuable about the pursuit of excellence, and never settling for your present situation, iterating day in and day out, while trying new things to see what sticks, while always in the pursuit of trying to make your art and stories more compelling and better overall. Because I think the moment you think you have reached the proverbial mountaintop is when you stop trying to climb further, and then stagnation settles in until the work you have done up to that point starts to rot and fade away, as memories are recontextualized under the weight of the sheer number of similar titles or entries. And the fact that each mainline entry in Final Fantasy is a self-contained and unique story and world is something that I do find very appealing. Each game acts as a different storybook with its own history and tales of heroism, where you can finish the journey, close the book, and be done with it. You can put it down and feel like you just completed an entire story. You had a beginning, a middle, and an end. Job done. At least for the most part. I'm a big fan of long-running narratives as well. Don't get me wrong, I love that. Hell, Final Fantasy XIV is my favorite entry in this series. But I think there is some value in that feeling of finality, where each entry tackles the hero's story in a different way and offers its own unique perspective on the concept. There's something about that which just never gets old for me. And I think society as a whole doesn't get bored with the hero's tale either. You just need to offer a unique perspective and some kind of, or level of individuality to distance yourself from the tag of generic, to set yourself apart from the crowd, and I think Final Fantasy over the years and years has successfully managed to do that. I think one of the aspects that keeps Final Fantasy feeling like Final Fantasy as a whole is the ability to weave the seriousness and heavy stories that it does portray alongside those silly, wacky moments it's also known for. Only in a small group of games could you have an evil clown destroying the world out of the pursuit of nihilism, while everyone else suffers in this rapidly decaying world. You pair that alongside a giant purple octopus that runs a coliseum because he couldn't defeat you all when he chased you down a rapids in the river or something. Do you see how Final Fantasy balances those wacky freaking moments with the really serious ones that punch you in the gut emotionally over and over and over again? It's that duality of Final Fantasy that is, in my opinion, able to keep it feeling like Final Fantasy at its core. Each game moves along the spectrum of how silly and wacky it is overall compared to how serious and dark the story and world can get. Final Fantasy X deals with death as a significant part of its overall narrative, but you can have also scenes that are just fun, but also meaningful to the overall narrative, like Titus and Yuna trying to laugh and just trying to fake it till they make it. That works for the story. It's been memed on because the laugh sounds like bad voice acting or bad voice direction, but that's the point. It adds to the overall narrative and story while still varying up the tone and feel of it. And as someone that gets bored if a game or a story does any one thing for too long, I like having that variance. I like how it can go between the over-the-top comedic moments with, like Moogles, for instance, in their entire existence, or riding chocobos, with having stories like Cloud's deteriorating mental state, or the story of Auden from Final Fantasy XV, or Terra's narrative in Final Fantasy VI. You pivot over to Final Fantasy VII, it deals with Cloud's continuing declining mental state, and then you can just screw off for a bit and breed chocobos, so you can race him in the gold saucer. That's just fun and whimsical. Final Fantasy is a series that at its core is best when it's not taking itself so seriously all the time and isn't afraid to just have fun and let loose, because that's the world. That is reality. You can have those really serious moments where it's a battle between good and evil or varying shades of gray, while also having moments that are just stupid and fun. And I don't say that in a negative connotation, I say that in honestly a compliment to the series. We pivot over to the Final Fantasy VII Remake, a more recent entry. What was one of the most well-beloved moments from that game? Think about it. It was the freaking Honeybee and dance-off. In a game all about overcoming destiny and taking the future into your own hands while juggling environmental degradation and corporate greed, the game still finds time to have a dance-off to lighten the mood. Just Dance could literally never. It's not like Final Fantasy is the only series that does this, and it isn't even comedic relief, I'd argue. It's like these bouts of lightheartedness. But Final Fantasy does them well. And when Final Fantasy does this balancing act very well, is honestly when I think we get some of the best Final Fantasies, in my opinion. I haven't beaten 9 yet, but from the little that I've played of it, it's a very unique world and set piece for Final Fantasy that is pretty actually silly, with these anthropomorphic animals all over the place, but the narrative can still get pretty freaking dark, can't it? It's that balancing act. It differs for each game, but once the game's able to find the balancing act that works for the story it's trying to present, that's when it really succeeds, in my opinion. And finding that balancing act from game to game can be difficult, because remember, Final Fantasy is a collection of stories. It's not just one continuing one. It's each story, each chapter is different to one another, and is more down-to-earth and gritty stories while contrasted with over-the-top ones, but always understanding that it needs some measure of all the above and some kind of spectrum between those tones to straddle that unique line for each entry, at least for the ones that I've played. I think that goes to show one of Final Fantasy's inherently polarizing aspects, because some people will prefer when Final Fantasy leans one way or the other when it comes to that overall tone. At least on the surface, like Final Fantasy 6 or 9, some people may prefer that feel to it. On the whole, because I would argue, both those games can get very grim dark and tell really human stories. But, on the whole, when you look at it, even from the outside looking in on those two titles, they're freaking wild. Final Fantasy VI for quite a long time at the beginning, at least in the first half, feels like a Saturday morning cartoon, and I think it has some kind of benefit from having that feel to it. It gets dark, don't get me wrong, but it also kind of relies on that tone for the first half to draw you in and to tell these different perspectives. Final Fantasy IX has like wandering hippos and anthropomorphic animals all over the place, like I said. But again, Final Fantasy IX can get very dark, at least from what I hear and from what I've seen so far in the game. And it can swap up on you quickly, and there's charm in that. No game is perfect, and I think it's important to be able to admit that. And that games and our perception of them is inherently subjective. I haven't beaten Final Fantasy VIII yet, but I know that's a very polarizing one, but from what I've played so far, yeah, the PC port of at least the version that I have that's not the remaster, the one before that on Steam, yeah, the port for PC is god-awful. But I still love 8 from what I've played of it. And I love Final Fantasy VII. It's probably my favorite single-player Final Fantasy. Our judgments and takeaways can be composed of a variety of mitigating factors that are unique to us, and that's one of the special aspects of about games as a whole. We could all play the same game, and we probably will later this year with Final Fantasy XVI. At least if you're going to play it, and walk away from it with wildly different takeaways, because we're all looking for something different from one another. And I think that's one of the strengths of Final Fantasy as a whole. And one of, if not, its main charm. Each numbered series is self-contained. It has its own world, lore, history, and characters, mechanics, etc. that makes it unique and will draw different people to it for different reasons. It just comes down to what resonates with us the most. And for me, that is Final Fantasy XIV. But I love the others that I've played as well. The one I probably liked the least was Final Fantasy XII, but when you have a series composed of the idea that each entry will be different to one another in some form or fashion, that will probably end up happening. Not everything needs to hit for you, and that's fine. I prefer them to try and make a different experiences overall with each entry, to see what works, what doesn't, and to just adjust accordingly for next time. And if something lands or doesn't, fine by me. Do your research before a game comes out. Judge whether or not you think that game is going to be worth your money. Wait for a sale if you want. Be a smart consumer. And if you do decide to pull the trigger and get the game, I hope you have a great time with it. And if not, that's okay. That's okay. We always move on to a different story, or to another story. For instance, Final Fantasy XII wasn't for me. I think it had aspects to it that I really liked. I liked the world of Ivalice, but there's aspects to the game, main ones, that make it probably my least favorite Final Fantasy of the ones that I've played, and that's fine. I'm not going to dwell on it. I'm not going to say the series is ruined because of that, or that I enjoy the series any less because of that. I just move on to the other ones that I do enjoy, because that's the charm of Final Fantasy for me. There's so many different stories, so many different worlds, so many different gameplay styles, and I've made a series of videos before, relatively recently, how I think each era has some kind of charm to it for Final Fantasy in terms of its gameplay. I like the turn-based game, I like the ATB-based games, and I like this modern iteration of real-time action RPGs that we have with Final Fantasy. I think they all have value to them, and I don't want to see any of them thrown to the wayside. I would personally encourage Square Enix to try and find some way to bring back turn-based into modern Final Fantasy. It doesn't have to be the mainline entries, it could be like a spin-off Final Fantasy series or something like that. But there's a charm to Final Fantasy that I don't think I get through a lot of the other series. It's not just any one thing, it's a collection of these things. How it juggles its tone for each game. How each game feels like its own individualized experience. It's something I find valuable. But there's always these like throughput aesthetics or designs that can go from one title to the next to always remind you, hey, yeah, this is Final Fantasy. Chocobos, Moogles, stuff like that. Even spell names. I think that stuff has value to breathe a sense of interconnectedness between these titles. It may be small on the surface, but I think in terms of immersion overall, it does have value. So I'm going to call the video there for today. Thank you all for tuning in. My pleasure making the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and helps more future content, and I greatly appreciate it. And hit the bell icon to be notified for when I upload in the future. Stay safe, everybody. Have a great day. Leave a comment down below with your favorite Final Fantasy and your story with it. When did you first play? What was your experience with it? I would love to hear your story and hear your perspective. Stay safe, everybody. Have a great day. Go play some video games if you can. And as always, I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye, everybody.